The race is on, and it's all happening at Alpine with Jack Doohan and team principal Oli Oakes out and Franco Colapinto in. So what's behind the latest round of nonsense at F1's most ludicrous team? And as one Aussie slumps, what caused the inexorable rise of Oscar Piastri? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to discuss all things Antipodean are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Michael Lamonato. Well, welcome back, Michael Lamonato, of course, from Fox Sports Australia. As ever, there are Australian things to talk about, so we sent up the bat signal in Melbourne, and here you are again in your capacity as professional Australian.
Yes, less of an Australian bat signal. It's more of a Vegemite symbol, I think. I see the logo in the sky, the national patriotic logo, and I can't help but get on the call with you. So it's a pleasure to be back.
Absolutely, and we're always there waiting to send up that signal when Australian-related things are happening. So there's a little bit beyond that scope in this podcast as well, but you do also know a thing or two about F1 in non-Australian terms, so you're also well qualified for that. And Scott Mitchell-Malm, well qualified for Alpine nonsense, certainly. We've done plenty of those, but it's been a while, though.
It has. I think it's been at least a few months since their last nonsense, so they gave it a go, but unfortunately... you can, I guess, you can just always rely on this team, and I think we should just set a caveat right now that when we say this team, that it's a very, very, very specific upper level part of this team. I think there is a lot of sympathy, both within this podcast, but also within the F1 paddock for the people at Team Enstone, for example, who. The best efforts to revive their fortunes just repeatedly get undermined by needless controversies and distractions that ultimately come from mismanagement and poor leadership.
Exactly, yeah. There is a difference there between those parts, and we're very much pointing at the upper echelons. But let's talk about Jack Doohan specifically first. So, Michael, obviously you speak for all Australians. So, how's everyone down there reacted? Is he big on the radar, or is it a bit of a smaller story given there's another Australian doing slightly bigger things with F1 at the moment?
Yeah, appreciate you recognising my victory in the recent general elections. I do represent all Australians here. And it has become a big news story because Jack Doohan's had I would almost say unexpectedly significant profile from before he even arrived in Formula One. I remember when Formula 2 started on the Australian Grand Prix calendar a couple of years ago and he was in the category. Everyone knew him. He was being swamped. He had to be carted around one of those golf buggies, very unlike other Formula 2 drivers at the time. So has been a significant story in that sense. Obviously, the name is there, and it's always funny when you find someone who maybe doesn't follow F1 that much, but you mention Doohan, and they always have to ask, why, is he related to Mick? Surely not. And you're like, oh, well, obviously he is. What are the odds? So there's sort of two different factors as to why this has become a big story. It's the son of the icon Mick, but also this very popular driver in his own right, and the sense of, I guess, injustice, really. We joked earlier that it's flags at half-mast in Australia because we feel like we've been wronged. But that is the case because regardless of what you think of, and we'll discuss this as the podcast goes on, of how he's been going, I think that the general sentiment in Australia is that 6 races is a little bit of a silly time frame to try and get an impression of how well he could have done. So it has become a bit of a big story. Obviously, behind Oscar Piastri as the championship leader, but not so far behind. Even this week after Piastri won a Grand Prix, it has very much all been about what's going on with Jack Doohan.
How does it compare to when you lost Daniel Ricciardo at the back end of last year? Because obviously, I still think I did get the impression there was a sentiment of, how should we put it, like, the way that came about, the fact he was dropped mid-season by Red Bull and the way that Singapore weekend played out, I still think that even Ricciardo had a bit of a narrative of he was hard done by. I certainly felt they hadn't really treated him with the kind of respect he deserved, but for very different reasons to Doohan. It does feel very much like the fact that he almost seemed doomed from the start, and this was a preordained thing. He was living on borrowed time, I think, has earned him a lot of sympathy across the board. But it's you've got an unfortunate contrast there of national heroes, established national hero versus would-be national hero, different ends of their F1 career. Is there any similarity between what happened with Daniel at the end of last year?
Yeah, there's probably, despite Doohan's popularity, less public grieving, I'd say, for losing him. But it is different because I can't remember if we discussed this as well in that last season of Daniel's career, but in particularly around that mid-season break time, after he didn't get that Red Bull Racing drive as we sort of suspected he was about to, there's kind of this acceptance that Well, almost this realization, this collective realization, or that actually, okay, he was okay before the mid-season break that season, but not really what we'd hoped he would have been. Never reached those highs that really he needed to that year. And so, while I think there was a lot of disappointment in Australia about the way it ended so suddenly and unexpectedly, people didn't really realise, because it was that sort of bubbling narrative through the weekend, wasn't it? And it was all unconfirmed and unofficial. People almost didn't realise till the Monday morning after the race. I think people were frustrated by that. But I think that there was this realization that he was kind of done, whereas with Jack, it hasn't been that case because he's barely got started. So it's very different, I'd say, in that respect.
Never really had much of a chance, did he? 6 races this year, plus that one at the back end of last year, and I guess it was seen coming. But the hope is always that someone will get a little bit of a better run at it than Doohan ultimately did. But Scott, let's talk about how this all played out, because you were all over this in Miami and after the race weekend as well. How did this process play out, and how did the replacement of a supposedly underachieving driver lead to the departure of Oli Oakes?
Oh yeah, well, I'm gonna do my absolute best to buck convention here and try and keep this concise, because otherwise I think I could talk for the entire length of the podcast of how the last sort of 72 hours have gone. The basic version is that Miami was kind of the microcosm of Doohan's season and situation at Alpine so far. Flashes of promise, a lack of execution, some clumsiness on his part, tension rising, and then ultimately a feeling that he wasn't doing the job. That goes back to the sprint qualifying session on Friday, the incident, pulling out of the garage, running out of room, needing to be pushed back to then take his place in the pit lane queue, losing some positions in that queue as a result, and ultimately not getting his final lap in and getting eliminated. He very much felt that the team had stitched him up basically by releasing him and Pierre Gasly at the same time at the garages, and then Doohan felt that meant he basically didn't have room to pull out the way he wanted, and that's what left him in the wall. The video footage didn't really support that, and I think that actually on reflection later on, there was an acceptance internally that that it had been a misjudgment on Doohan's part. I believe that Doohan believed he was caught out by Gasly. I think in the moment, Doohan genuinely believed he'd reacted to it and taken evasive action or whatever. Anyway, had to explain that in a little bit of detail because I think it influences everything that followed. We had the pretty explosive radio rant where Doohan, I was going to say all but accused Alpine of stitching him up, but he did. He said it was Alpine's fault. And when he was returning to Alpine hospitality afterwards, I think he'd done his F1 TV interview at that point, the Netflix cameras were on him straight away, as they were pretty much all weekend. They were following Alpine very, very closely. You could ponder that they maybe knew something we all didn't. I think it may have been that, but I think it might just also be it's a bubbling storyline all the time, and there was speculation that this might be Doohan's last race and so on and so forth. By the time Doohan got back to hospitality, he, I think, mistakenly had his initial conversation with his dad on the veranda at hospitality, which meant he was outside. The cameras could watch him. The boom mic came over, whatnot. And then Oakes appeared and gave him a gentle telling off. I would say gentle. It wasn't like a full on, he wasn't absolutely tearing him a new one, but it was along the lines of, don't do that over the radio. Like, I understand you're frustrated, but this doesn't help anybody. Then they moved it inside. Doohan was quite upset. I think he was very annoyed about the cameras being on him, blah, blah, blah. And I think that I tell that story because I think that then followed through the rest of the weekend. He did really well in qualifying, out-qualified Pierre Gasly for the first time. Then he has his collision at turn 1 in the race. And I think all of this just led to a point where it was unsustainable. We know that Flavio Briatore's wanted to put Franco Colapinto in the car for a long time, going back to last year. And I suspect what happened is a mix of maybe some more Latin American backing becoming available, plus Doohan giving him every reason to make the change. Doohan was told, I believe, on Sunday evening before leaving the circuit. And at some point between then and obviously Tuesday night, Oakes has resigned. Now, where those two become connected is that I know for a fact that Oakes had long since felt that the Colapinto situation, just in general, not necessarily because he has a personal issue with Franco, but just the whole thing had left Oakes feeling a little bit undermined, and like his job and the rebuild he was trying to do culturally at Enstone had been impacted. My suspicion, and it's only a suspicion so far because quite a few people don't want to talk about this properly at the moment, is that this was one step too far. It was the final straw for him in that his position had been ultimately compromised. I think he felt it was untenable. I think he knew going in that Briatore was the ultimate decision maker, but I think there was just a little bit too many occasions where Oakes was basically just having to do and justify things that he didn't necessarily believe in. What I don't know is whether Oakes had resigned or decided to resign at the moment I saw him legging it out the paddock quite early on Sunday evening, which ostensibly was because he had an early flight. It meant that his media session was cancelled. And again, the Netflix cameras were in tow. I did think at the time it was slightly interesting, but travel plans and whatnot, especially when you've had a rubbish weekend, cancelled media sessions, they aren't like totally out of the ordinary. But it is something I've been thinking about for the last few days. So that's a bit of a kind of whistle-stop tour of Friday through Sunday in Miami, and kind of how it all has led to where we are now. I didn't keep that as concise as I hoped to, but I have genuinely just given about 45 minutes worth of context in the space of 5 minutes. So I tried my hardest. I'm sorry.
When you've got a team that specialises in nonsense to the extent that Alpine does, explaining it is never going to be a quick job. But what's pretty clear is that Oakes ultimately just ran out of patience with the job of being the person who was having to face everybody, because he kept having to be the one who denied there was anything going on with Doohan. He had to deny it in the press conference, didn't he, on Friday? And he'd done it all season, and he did admit earlier in the year that some of the noise that was created was the consequence of what the team had done. But he never felt like somebody who was fully fronting up to defend his own decisions, but was having to do that on behalf of everyone else. And you've got to wonder how many other things that were going on in the background about the way that team was operating that he wasn't happy with, things that were just less public.
Well, all I'd say on that very quickly is I'm not sure about the Friday press conference, because there is a possibility that Oakes was saying what he believed to be the case. Because
I'm sure he believed it to be the case, but he knew that there was a possibility. That's what I mean. So yeah, I don't think the decision was made at that point.
No,
clearly,
I understand. No, I understand that.
Possible, yeah.
Yeah, I understand that. But what I mean is there were times earlier in the year where, and Oakes admitted this. So I've had plenty of chats with him over the season so far. Oakes admitted there are times where he didn't maybe handle it as he could have. He knew more than he could say, or he knew the reality behind the scenes, but he just had to put on a certain thing. So I think there were times when he was genuinely saying things that like he kind of knew weren't really the case. But I don't. Do you see what I mean? I don't think this was one of them, or it might not have been one of them. This might have like when he gave that answer on the Friday, because obviously Briatore was indicating, I think, to Oakes and other people back in Bahrain that Doohan was safe until the summer. It's possible that Oakes was operating on that understanding. And I think that just speaks to kind of the sort of dysfunction that had set in around all of this.
Well, there's no doubt.
Clues were kind of there, right? So. Like looking at that denial on Friday and at others during the season, because there were several, and considering Oakes's comments earlier in the year, I can't remember exactly when they were, or admission rather, that some of his language hadn't helped matters. Every time he was asked about the Doohan situation, he left the door hugely open to the interpretation of his language. Even on Friday, he specified that today Jack is the driver. It was open to a change as soon as Saturday for qualifying. And in retrospect, look, I thought that was sort of pretty unnecessarily loose language for the entire year. But now him having resigned and understanding more about the context of this and the timing of that, it's almost like he's been leaving hints the whole season, hasn't he? That there's this division between, I guess is sort of the purpose of this podcast, but between the executive and the team, I suppose, if we can sum it up like that. And there's the opinion or the desire for Jack to see at least half the season or the season, whatever. And then this other pressure that actually he could be gone at any time. And so we constantly got answers like, oh, we're going to start with Jack. Oh, of course, there's no story here. We're going to start the season with Jack for some races. There's no story here. And you got that all year. And actually now it seems like we know exactly what he was saying. He was just being totally honest and open about it. And it wasn't really his fault at all in a weird way.
Yeah, I think there was definitely an element throughout of Oakes knew he would have to be the front man for stuff he didn't necessarily believe in and wasn't necessarily responsible for. I think that is, to a degree, commonplace when you have a structure like Alpine has, where you have a team principal who is really kind of, I think what you might, in like a while ago, maybe just referred to really as the team manager on site, in charge of the race team. But Oakes was doing the, I say, day-to-day management of Enstone. Obviously, he wasn't there every single day because he was at F1 races. But he had a broader remit than just leading the trackside team. But he didn't have ultimate decision-making power. That was Briatore. That is not massively unusual. But I think as time has gone on, it's very clear that really, to operate in that environment with the way that Briatore works, I think Oakes had to be a complete stooge, and that is what he was not willing to be, clearly. And I think, I don't think there's anybody that works in F1 who's an absolute saint. So I'm not sitting here and pretending that Oakes is, a complete bastion of honourability or anything like that. But you have to, if we add 2 and 2 together and get 4, you kind of have to respect the sort of principles he's shown on this. Like, he clearly didn't agree with the direction that this was going in, and he's taken a stand.
And we should note that Alpine, when they announced his resignation, said that Flavio Briatore, the executive advisor, was picking up all his duties. It's not entirely clear whether there'll be a new team principal or team stooge, if you want to use Scott's language, coming in the future. I wouldn't be surprised if
I'd reply to that job advertisement.
Well, there's one application. That would be that would be good.
Someone's got to want to do it. So
yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many people would go for that one, so you might be the only applicant. But so that means that it's currently officially Flavio Briatore's show, but it was always unofficially.
But he's not a details person, so that has to change. That has to, what? I'm so curious now to see how this works. Like, he has been, he is obviously, he's come in, he's not just fiddled around the edges. He's made massive, immediate, immediate, like, he has made them very quickly, but he's also enacted them very quickly as well. Big decisions about serious elements of it. Obviously, the main one being his role, which obviously he likes to talk down, but his role in them not being a works team as of 2026, becoming a Mercedes customer. And obviously chasing Colapinto. You mentioned earlier, Ed, about, like, we don't know other stuff that's gone on behind the scenes where there might have been friction. Esteban Ocon's benching or dismissal before the end of last season. That was, to all intents and purposes, a Briatore whim before the end of the year that Oakes then basically had to enact and manage. That was something that Flavio drove. And all of these things, when you're kind of the ultimate person in charge of the project, are kind of, it's kind of okay to be just like, I want this to happen, this is happening, now you go and deal with this. But what happens when Flav's the man that has to deal with it? He's not going to be in Enstone every day running it, is he? So I assume that's being delegated to somebody else. I imagine he won't be too unhappy to do a bunch of media stuff in the meantime, so maybe we'll see him in press conferences and that sort of thing. But they're going to need someone, aren't they? Team principal, team representative, somebody to actually do some day-to-day management of that team, because that's just, I was going to say, that's just not Briatore's strengths, but that's certainly not where he fits in a modern F1 team.
I think we also have to stress that all of this confirms what we already knew, that really this is a team that's focused on financial results, not on-track results, because the things that have happened are not based primarily on improving the competitiveness of the team. They've made a lot of people redundant, and they axed a lot of people. That was a financially driven decision rather than about improving the performance of the team. And I think that regime got a bit of a free pass because obviously Alpine was underachieving so badly in the first part of last year, the overweight car, etc. And then actually finished very strongly that almost it looks like cause and effect. But I think they were on that trajectory anyway. So I think it's important to note that. But yeah, I just think it's a team that, as far as I'm concerned, the sooner that majority owner Renault finds a buyer for it, the better. That's undoubtedly the main thing. And it's going to make a lot of money for certain people. Fine. But you want to see a racing team in Formula One prioritising getting the results. Not to the point where it doesn't care about its financial situation, but it is a sporting results business, not a financial results business.
Well, at the risk of being seen to be standing on an anti-Renault soapbox, one final thing that is worth saying on this is that I really wish that the ultimate Renault boss, Luca Di Maio, would take some responsibility for this, because he has been at the heart of the dysfunction for several years now. I put together a list of everybody that's left since the rebrand, basically at the start of 2021, and you can start that with Cyril Abiteboul, obviously, because he was sort of shuffled out as part of that. But since then, you've also had the likes of Marcin Budkowski, who was executive director, Alan Prost, a non-executive director. Lauren Rossi came and went as CEO. Otmar Zafnauer came and went as team principal. Long-serving sporting director Alan Permain, chief technical officer Pat Fry, senior technical advisor Bob Bell, Davide Brivio. Remember him coming in as racing director. Matt Harmon, technical director. Then Bruno Faman, interim team principal. Then team principal. He was president of the whole thing as well. And now obviously Oakes as team boss. And you can have some high-level turnover, of high-level staff during an F1 stint. It's a 5-year period, so that's not totally unusual. But you've got literally 3 or 4 sets of regimes there. You could build 3 or 4 senior F1 leaderships over the number of across the number of people who have come and gone in the Alpine era alone. That's not even going back into sort of the last few years of Renault of its Renault guys. So. Ultimately, they're not all individual people that Di Maio has hired himself directly or indirectly or whatever, but he's been putting this stuff in place. He's been picking people that have picked these people and whatnot. And at some point, the buck has to stop with him, because I refuse to believe that you can become a businessman as successful as he is and be so unlucky that every single person pretty much that you've installed to run your F1 team has failed in some way, shape or form. So, yeah, I think there has to be some responsibility there. And part of me does wonder if maybe Oakes regrets slightly sticking up for Di Maio at the back end of last year when he arrived and said that Luca was getting too much stick, given how much support he'd given to the project and whatnot, because it's ultimately the environment that has been created by Di Maio appointing Briatore as the executive advisor that has led to all of this. So yeah, it's a shambles, and it hasn't arrived just out of, coincidence or bad luck, has it? It is mismanagement at the end of the day.
And it's so strange, isn't it? Because there's no other team in the sport, never mind one that is ostensibly a manufacturer team, where there is seemingly so little connection or even accountability between the team and the brand. Like, imagine this behaviour from Fred Vassar as the team principal of Ferrari if he were acting like Flavio Briatore, because regardless of the merits of swapping out Jack Doohan or whatever, all the other moves that you've listed there, it is embarrassing. We've described it as ludicrous, as shambolic. Like, these are not also just opinions of people on this podcast. It is the general consensus of the vibe around Alpine at the moment. What other car manufacturer, what other CEO of a massive car manufacturer like Renault would be appearing to do nothing and allowing the power vested in someone like Flavio Briatore, who's only been around a few months? So it also, the same applies for previous versions of Flavio at this team, to allow that power to go on unchecked and run the team in this way. It's really strange. And, they deny, of course, that the sale is on the cards, even though it seems to be the direction things are going. But it feels like it's the best outcome for everyone, considering no one seems to be winning right now.
Well, that's what I was about to say. Ed's got the answer for why this is allowed to happen.
It's allowed to happen because that's the agenda for the team, isn't it? It's financially focused. They appointed Flavio Briatore for an obvious reason, and I was fairly clear on my position on Briatore being appointed by this team in particular. Was not in favour of that. So yeah, it's just the way this team is, and all I would like is a degree of honesty in terms of what they're trying to do, because I just think it's ludicrous for them to pretend at the top level that they're about success, because they're not. Let's at least not sporting success. That's peripheral to the central objective here. So if that's the way they want to see, it's up to them. Let's get back to Jack Doohan now, Michael. Where do you fall on the spectrum that runs from Doohan's been done dirty to Alpine is right? You can speak as an individual rather than for all Australia on this one.
Yes, it is quite a spectrum, isn't it? It's hard to escape the feeling that he's essentially been set up to fail, either actively or passively, as we've sort of explained the dichotomy of different motivations from different people within the team. Simply because 6 starts in a season, 7 if we include last year's last-minute Abu Dhabi swap-ins, up to you whether or not you do, just doesn't feel like enough time for a driver who has made no obvious has no obvious massive trend of just clearly being someone who doesn't have it, right? It's not as if he's been in the in the six races and has been second off Gasly for the entire time and he's spinning it at the back of it. Like, that's just not happening. You know, in my opinion, for 6 races, he's put in what we should probably regard as a perfectly normal season for a rookie, and one who didn't race last year. You know, we shouldn't forget that he sidelined himself to commit to being an Alpine reserve driver at the request of the team, leading up to a full-time drive, presumably, that's now lasted only 6 races in this season. So I think it's hard to side with Alpine. You know, there's a semblance of a performance argument there to make. I just don't think you make it at this point. You know, even if we compare it, you know, in this season, we have had driver swaps after only 2 Grand Prix to Liam Lawson. But A, he was way further off the pace, and B, he's still in Formula One. I think that makes that situation different. Red Bull knew it was putting different pieces in different parts of the chessboard, not knocking them off entirely. So this situation, notwithstanding, okay, we also have this 5-race proposition, which is just remarkable, unbelievable maybe. But even that aside, to make this call at 6 races just doesn't seem to benefit anybody. Because even then, you know, if we get to 5 races down the line and Franco Colapinto's pulled out of the car and they're swapped back again, that would be unfair on him also, notwithstanding he had those 9 races last year. But that's not nearly enough time for a young driver to acclimatise to effectively a brand new team, a brand new car, a team that'll also be focusing a lot on next year, realistically. It's not as if there's going to be this great, you know, development movement that might help him adjust to the car or whatever the situation might be when he gets in it. It just doesn't seem to make any sense on a really performance level. And we know the reasons why it's been swapped in, but yeah, if you're from the Doohan perspective, I think he'd be entitled to feel pretty bitter about it, notwithstanding the lack of big headline-grabbing results.
Yeah, it's definitely a stupid situation from the team. If you decide a driver is the one you want, you've got to let it play out properly. Now, I have said that it's ultimately down to Doohan to deliver and make himself undroppable, which that is the way you've got to play the hand you've got as well as you can. And I don't think he absolutely maximised it and made himself undroppable. That was a high bar to set him, but I'm not saying that it's his failure fundamentally, but that was the only way he could make this work. He had to use incumbency, and I think, done a decent job. He's shown good pace. I think that there will be results that come. I have no doubt he would start scoring points if he stayed in that seat. But obviously, he was in a situation where you can make a case pretty much set up to fail. So I'm not saying Alpine's right in any way, shape or form, but I was quite impressed with Doohan in many ways. His underlying pace was good. He outqualified Gasly in Miami, for example. He was on course for points in Bahrain before the hard stint got away from him a little bit. So I think he's done a decent job in F1, but he didn't do absolutely everything he possibly could have done to make himself undroppable. I know that sounds harsh, Scott, but that's what you've got to do, haven't you? Even drivers have made these opportunities that were not great turn just by absolutely nailing it. And it's a bit harsh, but you've got to kind of prove you're a superstar to make yourself undroppable. And he showed he was on a trajectory probably to become a decent Grand Prix driver, but not a megastar one. And that was, you could say it sealed his fate, but it didn't lead to his fate. That was team circumstances that led to it.
Yeah, and all I would say is I don't massively disagree with what both of you have said there, to be honest. But the only thing I would slightly counter is I think that he was capable of doing a decent job. I don't think he necessarily did a decent job over the 6 races. I actually think it was maybe a little bit below that. I don't think he did a bad job, but I think it's somewhere between because I think you have to judge him in the context of other rookies as well, and other rookies have done decent jobs, good jobs, great jobs, right? Like Doohan has been the worst performing of the rookies this year. He has had those flashes, and that's what gave me sort of encouragement that I thought he could put it together. And I think if he had the full season, I think he would. I think if he'd had the full season, I think he'd have done a decent job. You know what I mean? Like, so I feel like he was trending towards potentially doing that rather than actually having done it over the 6 races. You know, 2 first lap crashes in 6 races isn't a decent job. That the heavy crash in FP2 at Suzuka, the 2 penalties that he picked up in the sprint and the Grand Prix in China, and even the way that faded in Bahrain. You know, when the other rookies have had the chance to score points, they have, haven't they? You know, even Isaac Hadjar, who came in with I think the least amount of dry running in an F1 car of all of the rookies. You know, he's been really, really impressive for me. And there is I appreciate that both of you are sort of saying like decent doesn't mean good. It doesn't mean great. It doesn't mean that he's been really impressive. But yeah, I think the problem is he gave them a competitive out. That's my issue with it. And with Colapinto, for example, at least last year, with the lows of the crashes and the difficult weekends, he scored points twice. You know, he might not have done it loads, but Colapinto is a proven F1 point scorer, and there wasn't evidence over the first 6 races that Doohan was definitely going to be that. That's what I would say. So if you're going to play devil's advocate and say, is there a competitive, performance-based reason to do this? Yes, there is, but it's come off of a very, very small sample set, and I think the conclusion would have been different if he'd been given a longer period of time.
But yeah, there's nothing I disagree with there. You can say that obviously he was in a situation where it was always going to be difficult for him, more difficult than the other rookies, because he knew there was a lack of backing. But equally, that's why I say you're the one who has to change that. And again, you know, it sounds harsh, but it's elite sport, and you're the one who's, to an extent, in control of your destiny when you're in the car. And one thing I would say is I don't believe that they were slowing the car down or anything to try and trick him or anything. They didn't not warn him about the DRS in Suzuka to try and catch him out, because you wouldn't do that. You know, there's an argument that they should have noticed in the simulator he was doing it, so he just assumed it was fine. There's also an argument he should have spotted it as well, particularly seeing as he sat out FP1 and presumably would have seen the 2 drivers who were out there doing it. So, yeah, it's. I mean, he's had a crack at Formula One. He's still there as reserve, obviously, so he can only do that, can't he? He'll stay there. He'll continue to be paid whatever he's paid, do the job for the team, and hope he gets another chance. But
surely won't, though. Like it's not the same as it's like one of the things I've said in some of the coverage that we've done is like basically Alpine have gone Red Bull light with this, haven't they? I mean, they gave him 3 times as long as they gave Liam Lawson. What more do you want? But the way that it happens previously with teams like Red Bull is the driver does get a second chance in F1 normally, but that's back at the second team, or it's a chance to get on the grid somewhere else. And my worry for Jack is I don't see that route. I think it would be a big surprise if Alpine put him back in before the end of this season, for example, because even if Franco doesn't deliver, you know, if they really want to do an objective, complete assessment for next year, they've got to put Paul Aaron in the car, haven't they? Their other reserve driver, and he's been really quick in private testing apparently. So if you really want to make your informed decision on 26, you've got to get some Grand Prix data from the other driver who's presumably an option. And I think so that's where I really feel for Jack, because unsurprisingly this has been a very divisive decision, and there are people who come down on the side that actually Doohan's not good enough and wasn't ever going to be good enough, so why not just get on with making a change and see if you can find better. But just remember, because I absolutely agree with your point, Ed, that it's elite sport, and that is the overriding thing in all of this. And this is not to say that you weren't remembering this, but for other people who are commenting on it, like the human element of it is galling. You know, he's a nice guy. He's a hard worker. He had a really good approach. And I think the way in which things have gone wrong this season are just even harder to take. Like, if you do everything, you don't make any major errors or whatever, you don't do anything that makes you look stupid, and you're just a bit off it. Like, I feel like you could probably take that because you can just be like, I didn't have it. But the little things, well, I say little things, like big consequences, but like the things like the way he lost it in the wet on the first lap in Australia and had the shunt there. Unfortunate, but you know, he was the only one that actually had the crash. Other people nearly had the crash. He was the one that had
behind
the crash.
him nearly had the same shunt.
Yeah. Then obviously what happened in Japan you've gone into, but even like the first lap clash in Miami, where I watched that onboard a few times, and there's a moment where, as he's doing the usual checks in the mirrors going down to turn 1, he does one big one to the right, and as he looks to the right, he moves to the right slightly. He drifts to the right with the car and then has to turn back left towards Lawson before the corner. It's stuff like that where you're like, did you ultimately have the kind of concentration, focus, capacity, whatever you want to call it, to not make those little errors? And because that's just what makes it harder, right? Like, just those moments where you had these big issues that then come to define your stint. Whereas if he had just spent 6 races being sort of 2-3 tenths off Gasly, I don't know. Maybe he wouldn't have been dropped. Maybe he'd have been dropped later on. Maybe he would just be able to go, gave it a go, but actually I wasn't quite as quick as I needed to be. Those other things that come in there, I think personally will make it harder for him to take.
I think there's also, it's also, just to pick up on something you mentioned, this being kind of like a Red Bull light situation. I think you could almost argue the opposite. It's like a super Red Bull situation, not just because we've got now this prospect of driver rotation, which was the original goal, wasn't it, of the Red Bull racing team in 2005, was it, with Christian Klein and Vidantonio Liuzzi? The idea was that they would rotate for as long as they wanted. It didn't end up happening, but now we're finally getting that situation. But it also feels a lot, listening to what you're saying, Scott, and you're right, like there's this build-up of little mistakes, and you could argue that these little mistakes are born of that additional pressure that was being placed on him because he knew he didn't have the full backing of the team in a way a rookie probably should. And he said that none of this affected him, but inevitably they do, especially a driver young. He's only 22 years old. We shouldn't forget that when we're talking about that human element. But that pressure cooker strategy is very Helmut Marko, continues to be very Helmut Marko, but we find this to be cranked up to 11 beyond even Helmut Marko's wildest dreams or beyond his imagination, where we've got this prospect that you could throw drivers in for 5 Grand Prix, not even half a season. And I just feel like, as much as with the Red Bull program, we've learned that actually sometimes that's not always the best way to get the results out of drivers. Yuki Tsunoda now perhaps being a good example of that, a driver who, 4 years was more than he needed at the junior team, but after a few years was able to show that he might be a driver worthy of promotion. Surely we're seeing now that, the opposite must be true in Jack's case, right? That 6 races was never going to be enough. 1 season perhaps wouldn't have even been enough. If he got through the season and continued to be okay and scored some points and not embarrassed himself, in any other era in Formula One, that certainly maybe it would have been more than another year. It might have been a perfectly reasonable midfield career. Drivers have dined out on just being reasonable in Formula One in the past. I guess that also speaks to the competitiveness of the current grid, but it just feels like, in a time when we're talking a lot about Flavio Briatore, his effect, the fact that, yes, he is successful, but it was a long time ago, this feels like a real throwback strategy that maybe Formula One's moved past.
The only counter to the Super Red Bull point, which I completely agree with and it is valid, is is basically Red Bull outdid itself over the last 12 months when it gave a guy a new 2-year contract extension, paid him millions at the end of that year not to race, and then sacked his replacement after 2 Grand Prix. So Red Bull outdid itself. If Red Bull hadn't moved the bar, then yes, I would completely agree with you.
There's a competition you don't want to win. But anyway, Franco Colapinto, Scott, what is the 5-race thing all about? Is it purely that's what we think is best for evaluation, or is it all about checks clearing?
It probably depends who Flavio's spoken to and what the reason he's given that individual. It wouldn't surprise me if the Colapinto camp think the 5-race thing's nothing, and actually he's in for the rest of the season and next year or whatever, because Flav might have told him that. It might be that the Doohan camp think it is definitely only 5 races and Jack's got a serious chance of coming back in for Silverstone onwards. I think, I genuinely, not in a flippant way, I don't think you can trust anything that is said about this. So I think it's wise to approach it with a degree of cynicism, because we were told 3 races ago that Doohan was safe until the summer. So I think it is just a moving target. I would say that I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt that they will genuinely reevaluate at some point. Whether that is after 5 races, whether it will be before then or after then, I don't know. I think it's tricky to know where someone like Aaron fits into the pecking order now that Oakes has gone, because Aaron was a high-tech driver in junior categories. I don't think it was a coincidence that he joined the fold after Oakes became team principal. I believe he has genuinely impressed other people within Alpine in his private testing work. But I don't know where he fits into Briatore's plans. If ultimately Flavio and Alpine really are only interested in performance, then Aaron should be as big a threat to Colapinto as Colapinto was to Doohan. It should just be as straightforward as that. But I just don't know. I don't know if that's the case. So I hope, and this is not because I wanted to see Jack fall off the grid and because I want to champion Franco or anything like that. But at the same time, I think it would be completely wrong to wish ill of Franco for his opportunity now. So I hope that it's more than 5 races. I think it's frankly astonishing to have announced publicly that he's got 5 races to basically prove himself, because it puts a deadline on him to get the job done. It means that there's going to be everybody's counting down to those end of that 5 races. Has he done enough? Every single race weekend, it's going to be a judgment on how does this look in the context of an upcoming reevaluation. If you're putting him in for doing, it's the same with Tsunoda coming in for Lawson at Red Bull Racing. If that's the change you're going to make that change for the rest of the season. Damn it! Like otherwise, what are we doing here? Just going to go through a complete rotation of the cast of reserve drivers. At Alpine, Aaron might be in before the summer break. Then Kushmani comes in in the second half of the season. Maybe they'll have to do a full-on Red Bull and bring back Victor Martin, who's at Williams now. And we've run out of reserves and young drivers. We need to get one of our old ones back.
Get Jos Verstappen in. He's flying in rallying. Bring him back to F1.
Exactly.
Well,
Lucas
Daniel
Di Grassi has
Kvyat,
unfinished
surely
business.
he's got to get a look in.
Yeah,
so many names we could throw around.
Yeah, exactly. There's great fun to be had in podcasting with just men sitting around naming old sports people, isn't there? That's one of the greatest joys in life. But we probably don't want to go quite down that route. I think that's my point is just like Franco's got the job, the drive now. He has the opportunity that he thought he was going to get when he joined Alpine. That was the reason for moving across from Williams. I hope he does a good job with it. I think there is a good driver there. I think the peaks last year were really impressive. It's just purely going to come down to whether he actually needs time and has time. Is he going to be more of a Behrman, Hadjar, or even a Gabriel Bortoleto type? I think Bortoletto's shown more in these 6 races than Doohan did. Or is he going to suffer the same fate as Jack? The one key difference between the two of them should be that he has Briatore's backing, because he's Flav's driver, isn't he? He's a driver that Flav wanted to bring into the organisation. Doohan was a driver that Briatore inherited.
It's a shame, I think, for Colapinto in terms of the fact that he finds himself in this position. Obviously, it's good he's got an F1 race drive because that's what he wanted. But I feel like he's done the drop in mid-season and show you deserve a drive thing. So while this is good for Colapinto to be back in, it's kind of put him into a slightly weird situation. And I'd sort of like to separate this from Doohan, because it's not about Colapinto versus Doohan. I think Doohan deserved a better crack at F1 as well, but I also think Colapinto certainly deserves another shot in Formula One. And now they've chosen him, they need to give him a chance. He's a great story. He's a driver who made it to F1 without a great deal of backing, and who has done so on achieving a decent level of performance throughout. So I think he's a really interesting driver from that perspective. What do you make of him, Michael? Are you expecting him to use that experience he's got in the bank from Williams to hit the ground running, and then we'll get to the end of the Imola weekend, everyone say, well, that shows the decision was right? Or do you think it could be a bit of a rough ride, particularly with Alpine's fluctuating form?
Yeah, it's a fascinating experiment. I mean, putting that human element we've all just discussed aside, it is very interesting to drop drivers into a team and see what happens. But the circumstances are really different. I agree. He did enough last year to prove he warranted a drive, and obviously happened too late to get on the grid, etc. But last year he was kind of in a win-win scenario, right? Like, he got a seat, he knew he had no prospects of winning, and also probably knew that it was pretty unlikely for him to get on the grid this year because it was so late in the day. So all he had to do was go out there and have a go. And lo and behold, he's really quick first time out, scored, it was a points twice in the first 4 races or whatever it was last year, did very well. But this is a completely different prospect, because for all intents and purposes, this is his, and explicitly, 5 race shot to make it in F1. Because if he doesn't do it in 5 races, and if we take, and this is a very big sentence, if we take what Alpine says on face value, that's it. Like, we get to 5 races and he's either made it or already hasn't. He could be pulled out of the car, because if that's the values the team wants to live by, then that has to be the case. And then it might be over, because I think the quality of the grid is so high at the moment that even a driver in Doohan's situation, or in Colapinto's situation, or in any sort of driver doing perfectly fine situation, that might not be enough, because there is so much talent pushing up even into Formula One potentially as soon as next year. So I think the circumstances are really different. I think he'll do well, but I think as well, on top of that, he hasn't had massive acclimatization to the team. Pre-season testing is a while ago, but didn't have that. He hasn't had so many races that he's been able to get up to speed with the car that much. I believe they've been rotating simulator duty, so it's not as if he's been doing sim for 6 races straight and that's been it, and he's got that basis to fall back on. It's been a very patchwork introduction to being an Alpine F1 driver. His benefit is he's going to do that in Europe, so tracks typically that are better known among the junior drivers. So that works to his advantage. I haven't looked at his specific record at the tracks that are coming up, but nonetheless, he hasn't had that many wins in his junior career anyway. So I think it's a much high pressure situation. He's shown he can deal with the high pressure, but then we can also look at the end of last season, right, when there was talk about him trying to lock down deals at other teams, and suddenly we saw more mistakes coming into his game. Interesting to see if that's replicated. So I'm interested. Look, I'm interested. It's a great experiment. Again, to come back to the point, I do hope he does well, but I don't think it's as nailed on as looking at his first 5 races at Williams and going, well, he'll just do that, and then he'll be in the car for the rest of the year.
Just on the point about track record, I'm pretty sure he pulled off like a mega pass last year to win the F2 race, one of the F2 races. I think it was on the last lap, and I think it might have even been against Paul Aron. Now they're stable mates at Alpine. It would have been great if it was Doohan that he put it on. Just very fitting. So no, like I think I think it'll be good for him to be doing this at tracks that he at least has some experience of. I think it maximises the chance of hitting the ground running. So yeah, all the best to him. I think a big part of it will be, as Ed sort of alluded to, which of those circuits are ones that actually the strengths of the Alpine come to the fore and the weaknesses are mitigated.
Yeah, I think the one thing you can't afford to do is have the car coming back on a truck with a bag of bits by it. That's the thing he needs to watch out for. And I'll be interested to see about what the wider thing is, because obviously there's the financial aspect, and I'm sure there's a belief that having him actively in the car will get some deals over the line as well, and that's clearly an important focus for them. But yeah, it's a tough gig, I think, for Colapinto. He's done some TPC running. He's had a few offs in the TPC running as well. So, you know, that shows he's a driver who's still trying to impress. But I think he just needs to do what he did when he initially came in with Williams and just show that ability to make the most of it. And an early result will settle things down, I think, quite a bit. So that's what probably he needs to focus on and just try and just get a point on the board early on, because that'll calm down the questioning. But certainly he's gone into a team that likes a bit of nonsense. So who knows what the next 5 races will bring for Colapinto, but hopefully now he's been selected, just as should have happened with Doohan, he's got to be given a fair crack of the whip, and it needs to be more than 5 races really, but let's see how that plays out. Well, let's look into a slightly less nonsense part of the grid now, Michael, and to give a sense of deja vu to everyone, we've got to ask you to be the voice of Australia once again. How has Piastri's transformation into a regular winner changed the way he's viewed there? Is he now a proper Australian sporting superstar?
The transition is on. You know, I think we spoke last year about how he was still very much in Daniel Ricciardo's shadow, purely from character grounds, I think. This year, very much more coming to the fore. You know, the response at the Australian Grand Prix was enormous because we saw so many glimpses of, well, we saw the performance last year, just lacked the consistency. But I think for your average punter, you just remember the highs a lot, right? Like, and then the troughs in the middle, you just explain away or forget about, or don't even watch those races. So this year, people have come in with expectations that are high, and he's been meeting them immediately, straight off the bat. Much bigger news item, you know, fielding way more calls from radio stations as my barometer of how important a subject is to the general population. People want to know more about Oscar Piastri. I think there's also been, I'll be interested in your guys' perspective on this actually, but I think there have been a few more cracks in the armor shielding his character from people. I think we're seeing a bit more of the real Oscar Piastri, for want of a better phrase, and that always plays well here because, again, we like our sports people who are characters. You know, they tend to be the ones that capture the imagination best. That's not that surprising. It's probably the case everywhere, but, you know, we've been spoiled for them in the past. So playing into that side of things is certainly helping. But fundamentally, Australians love a winner, and he's doing a lot of that. So Australians love Oscar Piastri.
Where do you stand on Oscar Piastri, Scott? Have you seen those signs of the character coming through a little bit more? I mean, certainly the results speak for themselves, but he's showing his edge, isn't he, I think? Let's say that.
He is. I think, given the subject of the podcast up to this point, though, we should obviously make the acknowledgement that well-bowled Oscar and Mark Webber for seeing the nonsense for what it was and realising, probably best that we move heaven and earth to make sure we are not part of this. That was you did that piece on the sort of alternate reality of what would have happened had Piastri not extracted himself from Alpine, or obviously the people around him had extracted him for him. Not that there was officially anything to be extracted from, such was the shilly-shallying nature of the nonsense Alpine Piastri contract situation. And since then, he has only gone from strength to strength. I think this is actually a few months ago now, but I remember finding the first interview I did with him at the back end of his F3 title winning season. And it's very amusing now to think that I think the sign off for that was basically linking him to the Ricciardo situation and saying Alpine's already lost one mega Australian, it better not lose another. I remember being so impressed by two particular things even back then. One was the standout nature of his just really, really clinical driving, really, really sharp. Won that F3 title on racecraft, not on pure speed, and was actually really disappointed with his own qualifying performances that year. The other thing was there was just amazing capacity to just identify little things that he could do and improve on his own. He did, I think it was the Turkish Grand Prix weekend that year. He was shadowing the race drivers as part of his junior position, and one of the things really interestingly he picked up from them at the time was that was sort of how to optimize his communication. Basically, what were they looking out for, and what were the kind of details to focus on. And it's just funny just thinking now, 5 years on, just how much precise communication and excellent racecraft and an improvement in his qualifying have become absolute pillars of the driver that we're seeing now and the season he's putting together. So he is someone who's it's very easy to jump on a bandwagon when you win F3 and F2 back to back as a rookie, and I'm not even counting Euro Cup there. That was obviously a second year campaign, so just it didn't stand out in the same way. It's easy to say, oh, this guy's clearly really good when they've won those championships, but I think there were specific things about him that I really like the look of back when he was in F3 and F2. But even then, I would say that he has quickly evolved into an even better driver than I thought he was, and maybe even thought he could be. I didn't expect him to mature into what we've seen so far in 2025 so quickly. And I think what you said a couple of times, Ed, rings really true, which is it's almost like he skipped a year in his development. It feels like this is kind of 2026 spec Piastri ahead. He's basically just sort of ahead of his own curve.
We've got a few questions from the Race Members Club on Piastri that we'll quickly rattle through, as that's a good way to talk about him. One from Snooker Matt, who says, is Oscar Piastri the only driver with the measure of, or at least ability to match Max Verstappen in wheel-to-wheel combat? He looks slightly more in control of the overtake in Miami than Norris did a few laps later. Scott, do you want to have first call on that one?
I think he is capable of being as ruthless as Verstappen is in wheel-to-wheel combat. I disagree with the suggestion that there's been... I feel like the polemics in online debate now are worse than they've ever been, and Miami actually seems to be one of the worst examples of that, just across the board. There were so many different things that just seemed so incendiary and just, I don't know, just based on just simply not knowing how racing works and what the reality is in F1. And one of them is that this idea that Piastri has set like these terrible precedents over the last couple of events now for how he's behaved on the inside into turn one against Verstappen in Saudi Arabia, and then Kimi Antonelli at the first corner in the sprint in Miami. And that's why Verstappen got away with what he did to Norris at turn two in the Grand Prix. It's nonsense. The rules are what they are, and Piastri is incredibly sharp, so he knows what he can get away with, and that's all he's doing. He's got, we saw last year with that move he pulled on Norris at Monza, that he is really uncompromising, and he has an idea of what is fair, what is aggressive, what is too high risk, and what is not. And I think he's more at the Verstappen end of that than the Norris end of that. But I haven't seen anything so far that makes me look at him and think, you're overly aggressive, you're out of control in the way you race things. And I go back to what I saw in F2 and F3 to support that. So I think there's a possibility that Piastri might come to have the best racecraft on the grid of any driver.
I think there are two elements in that as well. Like you've talked about that self-analytical nature. We can see, and it's something we talked about Max a lot last year when he was pulling those very line ball moves, some of them over the line moves, which is he clearly just understands where the regulatory line is as well. Like he knows the game he's playing. It's a little bit less, I think there's a lot of instinct in there, but there's clearly this thoughtfulness in it. And then I guess to go back to the question, I don't think I completely agree with everything Scott said. I don't think it's that he's the only one who can do it, but I think he's the only one of the front runners who's approaching battles with Verstappen without baggage from previous seasons. I think that's definitely part of Norris's game. Russell had that somewhat unusual beat with Verstappen at the end of last year. I guess we haven't seen fully how that's going to play out over time, but that's there. Charles Leclerc's battle with him a lot. Lewis Hamilton, we don't have to remember that. I guess Antonelli's the only one who maybe doesn't have anything either. Be interesting to see if he's in the position to race him as regularly. But I think Piastri's coming to this really clean, and I think we're seeing that has an influence when he's racing with Max. And also, it sort of works vice versa, right? Like, Max hasn't raced him that much either, which means there's just this grey area of neither of them knowing how to pull one over the other one, and we're seeing it all happen for the first time.
A question now from Yash that you can take, Michael. Is this Oscar Piastri's title to lose now?
Yeah, well, in some sectors of Australia, he's already won it. So, that's all good for us. It's way too early to say that, isn't it? I mean, it's 6 races in. We are a quarter of the way of the season, which feels somehow surprising and alarming at the same time. But all we can say, which is a genuine answer to a question that needed to be asked at the start of the year, is that he's in the fight. We didn't know at the start of the year for certain whether he would be able to contend for the title, whether it would be all Norris or whether McLaren would even have a shot at it to begin with. I think it's clear, at 6 races, again, a quarter of the season, that consistency is there. We've seen a lot of racing now, maybe not as much as, if we get to the mid-season break, it'll be a different question, but we've seen enough to know that, Piastri's weak performance was 4th on the grid and victory in the Grand Prix. That's not going to hold up forever. He's going to have some bad races in the way that Norris had a difficult Middle Eastern swing this season, but the consistency is clearly good enough that he should be a title contender through to the finish. So I think that's the answer we've got so far. I wouldn't say it's his to lose. I think that does a disservice to Lando Norris at this point.
I'd say it's his to win. Let's put it that way. He's got everything he needs to do to win it, but still a very, very long way to go. And it's a question from Nick of Oz, who said, I asked a few races ago about the sample size on judging Piastri and his progress. 6 races down, 4 victories and 2 second places in sprints. What's your assessment? Yeah, well, the previous question was about whether we can say he's definitely made that step and breakthrough. And I still want a few more than 6 races, but he's been quick and competitive everywhere. And even on his weaker weekends, he's still been strong. So I think he's shown he's a driver who we can expect to be there week in, week out. So,
well, he's won on his last 2 weekends. Saudi Arabia and Miami, he was the second fastest McLaren driver, and he won both the races.
Yeah, which is hugely beneficial. That's how you rack up big numbers in terms of wins. So I think he's done everything that could have been expected of him or asked of him this season and more. So that's about as big a thumbs up as you can get for him. But Scott, there's a question related to that from Thomas Gustafsson, who says, it seems obvious that Oscar Piastri is a more accomplished driver now than at the end of last season. But how does that happen? How do the drivers improve during the break? Is it all mental, or is it like when studying for an exam and you go to bed and when you wake up, all the stuff has found a place in your head? Only this league was a couple of months. Or is it simulation racing? It's fascinating how they can get better while not racing. He does like a bit of sim racing, Piastri, doesn't he? Not quite at Verstappen's level, but he does indulge, doesn't he?
Yeah, but I think the answer to this kind of lies in, and maybe this is a little bit too broad for kind of what the question kind of wanted to get, but first of all, it comes down to what you're trying to improve, because there'll be different things you need to do for different elements of it. A big thing, the 2 big things for Piastri over the winter were the not insignificant tasks of getting slightly faster and getting slightly better with his tyre management. 2 absolutely core things to master in F1. And I think the other elements to his game that needed refinement have been an extension of that. So how's he done the speed and the tyre management? That's obviously a lot of work spent over the winter discussing things with the engineering team, understanding things like how to maximize tyre prep, where he wants to get the car at the start of a race weekend so he doesn't start on the back foot, and is then making good refinements with his comfort and exactly where the limit is by the time he gets to qualifying, rather than chasing things and needing bigger steps in himself or whatever it may be. The tyre management, obviously, it shifted slightly for this year in terms of the tyres. It's a bit of a reset for everybody, which is a good chance for good diligent work over the winter. Again, nothing. There's no silver bullet there. It will be hard research, basically, into right, where were the weekends where it went away? What was I doing specifically? Where was I loading up the tyre more than Lando was. And also, I think once you get a little bit, an extra tenth or two of pace out of yourself, suddenly that management becomes a bit easier because you can sacrifice a tenth or two over the course of a lap in a race to buy yourself back a tiny bit of tyre life, for example. Whereas if you're having to absolutely push the car to the limit just to try and stay on the level of the other guy, then you're going to be asking more of your tyres that way. And I think all of that then leads him into a better situation where he's in control of his weekends. He's not desperately chasing things. And because of the peaks being higher, I think he can then not chase too much when he's having those bad weekends. He did slightly underperform in qualifying in Miami. He admitted himself he thought that had left himself in a position where he wasn't going to win the race. So he didn't go piling into the first corner thinking, I must make all of this up now. It was a case of get through, see what you can get out of it. And then as soon as he realised, as the path opened up for him with Norris running off on the first lap with that incident with Verstappen, dispatched Antonelli quickly, got onto Verstappen, took his chance against him brilliantly, and then bolted. Knew that was his window to move clear and claim that victory for his own. And if he hadn't done that, he wouldn't have won the race because he was slower than Norris in the second half of it. So I think, I appreciate that's not getting into some silver bullet specifics, but I think that broadly covers the kind of process that you need to go through to go from where he was last year to being as refined as he is now at the front.
And there's an even more boring element to it as well, I think, which is just experience.
Even more boring.
Tracks.
What a phrase.
Yeah, no,
thanks, mate. Cheers.
Yeah, well,
Always
we've got to be
a pleasure
honest
to
on
have
this
you on,
podcast.
Michael.
It's simply experience, right? I was speaking to him at the end of last year, and because if you remember, he was the highest scoring driver in that European leg of the season, which interestingly we're about to enter. And I said, well, what happened? At the end of the year, start of the year, whatever it was, start of his second season, end of the year, what's gone wrong? He said, well, they're just tracks that I've been at less, and it's not that surprising that the European tracks he typically has performed better at over his first two seasons, and now we're just seeing that experience gap close a little bit and being able to build on that. And yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting getting to Europe at tracks that he has a deeper knowledge bank on, as to whether we see another little step, how that changes. That's why it's boring. It's doing the job, going to work. That's all I meant.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because in the question it alludes to, do you just sort of go to sleep, albeit for a few months, and it all kind of coalesces? But a big chunk of this is about taking a lot of what you've learned and almost sort of internalising it, putting it into the subconscious processing, rather than just sort of having to actively think about it, because that's really what we're talking about when people talk about instincts and that kind of thing. A lot of it's learned, and there's a lot of the things that you need to do that you need the chance to kind of absorb properly, and having that break can help that, and having a break where you're not constantly thinking about it as well. Now, you'll have done work, he will have thought about it, but it's difficult when you're just going from race to race with 24 races. It's a frenetic calendar. You're doing sim preparation, you're doing marketing days, you're trying to grab a little bit of your own life in between it. And it's pretty busy. There's a lot happening, and there is a value in just stopping and having the chance, A, to reflect, and B, also to not think about it, because that will get you to a point where where you just do internalize a lot more of that stuff, and it's just there for you to deploy. So, yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, Scott, it did seem like it almost come back as the 26th version of himself, and that's what I've been really impressed with, just the steepness of that learning curve, which combines with the fact that just sort of in the heat of battle, he's just a good, calm, collected driver. He's not sort of distracting himself. He's just playing the race as it plays out in front of him and just doing what he does, which is the big challenge, isn't it? It's just executing your skills as you should, as if it doesn't matter, and you're not stressed by it when it matters most, and that's what he's incredibly good at. So it's going to be fascinating to see how this championship plays out, because as Michael talked about, he did have that kind of trailing off at the back end of last year, and I'm sure if we get to that run of races this year and he's leading the championship and it's still close, there'll be questions about that. Well, how do you avoid that? And that's going to be a challenge down the line. But yeah, he's had a fantastic season, doing an incredible job. Now, before we go, a quick reminder that we do have a 75% off the Race Members Club membership with us, with our special offer on Patreon to mark the 75th anniversary of F1. You get loads and loads of extra content, ad-free podcasts and videos. You get to ask us questions on this podcast. There's bonus stuff we do on race weekends. Normally us, rambling in a hire car or on a bus or one of the places we end up. So you get to see behind the curtain, and we've really enjoyed doing that. So if you're interested in that, head to Patreon via the link in the episode description, and you can sign up 75% off for the first month. Well, thanks very much to everyone who threw questions in. Thanks, Michael and Scott, for your answers. And, of course, a special thank you to the great nation of Australia for channeling its opinions through Michael. So there's millions to thank there. And, looking forward to having you on again in the future. Do you want to take this chance, Michael, to plug anything else you do? You're quite a prolific podcaster as well.
Oh, yes, you can just go and search for me on my very rarely used social media accounts. I guess all the links are there rather than boring you with it. But, look, I'll get back in my box. I'll await for the next signal in the sky, and I'll be right back at it. Hopefully with better Australian news, I suppose. Or 50% better Australian news, I suppose, because 50% was pretty good.
Yeah, well, we can guarantee that more Australian things will happen in Formula One with Oscar Piastri at the front. That's for sure. So thanks very much to everyone. Thanks for listening, and stay with us for more from the world of Formula One.